Hello and welcome to this second episode of Dodge Adventures. This time we're going to focus on the battle for Koevering, which was fought around Veghel at the tail end of Operation Market Garden. We're going to drive around the sites, see some of the monuments, different areas of the battle, and during our episode we're going to talk about why the battle was fought here, why the Germans chose this area to attack the corridor, how it was unblocked and what it meant for Operation Market Garden. So a lot to cover. Time to go! Our first stop of today is the windmill at Koevering. It was completely destroyed in 1944, so only a monument remains. But it is there that the Germans found a hole in between the Allied lines, and from there they were able to reach the corridor. That's our first step, just up the road from here, so let's go and see it now. Since 1299, at this location a windmill had stood. It was destroyed in September 1944 in the battle and it was not rebuilt. And now this monument with the two grinding stones is all that remains of a once proud windmill. The Koevering Windmill and the hamlet of Koevering nearby is what gave name to this last battle, the last time that the Germans cut the road near Veghel. At the beginning of Operation Market Garden, the 101st Airborne Division was able to secure their objectives, the bridges at Son, Sint-Oederode and Veghel, and the city of Eindhoven with its bridges. After the British ground forces from 30 Corps linked up with them on the second day of the operation, the initiative passed to the Germans. They were able to attack the corridor at any location, while the Americans with British support tried to keep the road open and traffic flowing north. On the evening of the 19th of September, the Germans launched their first attack on the corridor, with the objective being the bridge at Son. They were stopped at the very last second, but tried again on the morning of the 20th, before being pushed back from the corridor by the advancing British ground forces. The Germans then focused their attention on Veghel. This was where the Allied positions around the corridor were at its narrowest, and with 4 bridges in a small area it offered the best chance of success. If successful, at Arnhem the British 1st Airborne Division and at Nijmegen the Guards Armored Division and the American 82nd Airborne Division, plus all supporting units, would be cut off and could be destroyed. The Germans never stopped thinking big. On the 22nd of September they attacked the corridor north of Veghel with forces from both the east and the west, and they achieved some measure of success as they were able to block the road for over 24 hours. By now the soldiers started calling the corridor Hell's Highway. On the 24th of September they launched their penultimate assault on the bridges at Veghel, this time with forces only coming from the west. In the early morning fog they were able to take the sand dunes overlooking Eerde, but were not able to get inside the village, which was stoutly defended by paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. During the afternoon the Americans were able to retake the sand dunes in vicious hand-to-hand combat, making it impossible for the Germans to reach Veghel using the most direct route. After unsuccessfully trying to evict the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment from Eerde, which is located behind me, the Germans now had to circle around the village to try and find a different route to the corridor, and they found a hole in between the Allied lines. The 501st behind me, busy as they were, repelling the attack that was still going on, and behind the camera was Sint-Oederode, where the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was located. The Germans were able to find this hole in between the lines, and they moved with about 200 men under command of a Major Jungwirth towards the corridor. And it wasn't just the 200 men, it was also Jagdpanthers of the 559 Schwere Heerespanzerjägerabteilung. These were tagging along these men towards the corridor. And it was down this sandy road that they were able to reach the corridor, which is located at the end, where you may just be able to see the new built motorway. So now we're going to follow in the footsteps of the Germans, driving towards what remains of the Koevering Road. It's hard to imagine, but in 1944 this was Hell's Highway. The German objective, the bridges across the Zuid-Willemsvaart Canal, are located directly behind me in the direction of Veghel. After the war, the road was straightened, and this bit has been abandoned ever since, and even more recently the A50 motorway was built on top of this. Also important, this was completely open terrain. The trees, even though they look old, were not here during the September 1944 battle at the Koevering. The German attack came from behind the camera, and they methodically moved throughout the British supply column, destroying everything inside. So this whole road was now one big inferno of burning vehicles.
The Germans estimated they destroyed around 50 trucks and took 40 men prisoner. The Allied death toll is unclear, but based on the Commonwealth War Grave Commission's burial records, it wasn't a total massacre. I estimate that at the very least 10 men lost their lives, not counting those that were wounded and died later at a hospital.
So besides the men here fighting for their lives on the road, the first to notice something was wrong were the men of the 907th Glider Field Artillery. They were dug in close to the bridge, and they were providing fire support, firing in support of the 501st, who were fighting at Eerde. And they noticed something was wrong. So let's visit their location and talk a bit more about what happened there. It's difficult to imagine, but this was in 1944 completely open farmland.
The original corridor road is still visible. Behind the Dodge you can see a road, and that is the original road leading towards the bridge across the Zuid-Willemsvaart, only a couple of 100 yards away. The 907 Glider Field Artillery Battalion was dug in behind me in the fields, and they were firing in support of the 501st at Eerde. And they noticed something suddenly. Well, they noticed the lack of something. They noticed that traffic had stopped across the corridor. And that shouldn't happen. That never happened during the day that traffic stopped. So they went and investigate, and they saw pillars of smoke coming from the area down the road, and they knew something was wrong. So they called their commander and they got orders. One battery was still to fire at Eerde, supporting the 501st, and the other battery was to be placed on the road, not dug in, so they could be moved out immediately, but in direct fire mode. So when the Germans came, they would have some last-ditch defense of anti-tank weapons that could destroy the tanks. Luckily, the Germans never pushed through their attack. They never followed up. They were too busy at the Koevering, and this area remained secure in Allied hands. Going back down the corridor from which we came, and next up is the front line. September 1944, a ditch ran alongside this road, which is perpendicular to Hell's Highway, which you can see behind me. And it was this ditch that became the front line. The 907 Glider Artillery Battalion, they had security troops, they had 30 cals and 50 cals, and they started to man this line. And it was quickly reinforced by other troops. Stragglers who happened to be in the area, who were driving on trucks and had to flee to safety to get away from the Germans, but also glider pilots on their way back to Brussels from having delivered their gliders near the Nijmegen area. And also a brigadier, Glyn Hughes, and he was the commander of the 8th Corps medical units. And he happened to be here, and he organized the defense here. Luckily it was never tested, but even so he received a bar to his DSO, a Distinguished Service Order, which meant he had already been awarded one in the past. So this line became the front lines. But how these glider pilots came to be in this area and what their role was, we're going to discuss further down the road in enemy territory where the action happened. Driving in the same direction that we just did were trucks with glider pilots. As I said earlier, they landed their gliders in the Nijmegen area. They'd been active there, and now they were on their way back to Brussels to be flown home to England and from there be ready for another mission. One of those was Captain Andros, and he did not believe everything would be fine. He had a funny feeling about the Germans. They'd been very active around Nijmegen, and he was sure there would be more trouble ahead. So he told his pilot buddy, he said, don't drop your weapons, keep them with you. You never know what's going to happen. We can always leave them on the continent here when we get to Brussels and to safety. So when these trucks were suddenly under a withering German fire, he knew what to do. He formed up with a perimeter with his glider pilots, and then even going further than that, he made sure that most of the trucks that could be turned around here and drove back towards Veghel. He did not want them to fall into enemy hands. Captain Andros was awarded the Silver Star for his actions.
The Germans again completely blocked the road going north, but their goal of reaching the bridges at Veghel could not be attained, so now they tried to hold on as long as possible. The Allied response was swift. Tanks from the 44 Royal Tank Regiment were sent out to reopen the road, but 2 Shermans were destroyed in quick succession. Because it was getting dark, the attack was then called off. Reinforcements were needed to remove the Germans from the corridor, but they were not available in Veghel. Thus it was that the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, located 5 miles away in Uden, was ordered to march all through the night to the Koevering. On the morning of the 25th, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 506th, supporting by tanks from the 44 Royal Tank Regiment, started their attack, but they did not get far. The Germans were well dug in, and with the aid of Jagdpanthers and a number of anti-tank guns, they were able to stop the attack. The 2nd Battalion of the 506th, which had been kept in reserve, was now called forward to make a wide detour around the Koevering and attack the Germans from the east. They too were supported by British tanks.
The original bit of corridor that we filmed earlier is behind me, where you see the trees on the other side of the motorway. So the corridor has now been blocked permanently. The A50 motorway has been built on top of it, and we are going to follow the footsteps of the 2nd Battalion during their afternoon counterattack on the 26th of September. And for that we need to turn the Dodge around and drive back. Having marched down the same road that we just driven upon, they cleared the woods on my right hand side. They were supported by tanks from B Squadron 44 Royal Tank Regiment, and they were following the infantry up close, mostly from the road that we are on now, and for one of those tanks, disaster struck. It rounded a very big sand dune that's now long gone, and suddenly it found itself face to face with one of the Jagdpanthers we discussed earlier. It was very quick off the mark. It fired and it hit the Jagdpanther square on the frontal armor and bounced off, doing absolutely no harm whatsoever. Then it was the turn of the Jagdpanther. It fired and immediately hit the Sherman tank, and 3 of the crew were instantly killed in the ensuing inferno. Lance Sergeant Newmans, Trooper Hollins and Huggins, all 3 of them died in their tank and were later buried in the field to the left for a while before they were moved to the Uden War Cemetery, where they still rest today. And on my left, on the tree, is a monument that was placed there by the widow of Lance Sergeant Newman. She never remarried. She always stayed faithful to her husband, which she lost here at Koevering. Our last stop of the day is just up the road at the A50 motorway for the conclusion of today's episode. We are back at the motorway. We're not too far from where we started, because the Koevering Windmill is just across the motorway up the sandy lane, and then we're back where we began our tour today. After Lance Sergeant Newman's tank was destroyed, The attack continued, and some units were even able to cross the road in the evening. And that meant that the Germans were now completely surrounded, for it wasn't just the 506th that had attacked the Germans here at Koevering. From the south, the 502nd and the 7th Armored Division were also attacking up the road, trying to reopen it. So the Germans were now completely surrounded, and during the night they decided to pull out. It rained constantly, there was heavy artillery fire, and for some reason the Germans were able to extricate themselves without the Allies knowing. They took the same route that they came on to this road, which was towards the Koevering Windmill, and they just vanished. And incidentally, this is the same night that the British at Arnhem also withdrew across the Rhine. The next morning, the Americans from all sides reopened their attack, only to find out that all the Germans had long gone. That didn't really mean that the road could be used immediately, because the Germans at mine diverges had booby-trapped the vehicles, and it took a couple of hours to reopen the road, and by that time it was leading nowhere. The British had withdrawn from their perimeter at Oosterbeek, and Market Garden had failed. That concludes this episode of Dodge Adventures. There's another one coming soon, so please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any one. If you like this one, let me know by leaving a comment or hitting that like button. That's it for now. Time to go home. Runs again. See you. Bye bye.